didn't want people telling jokes or using humor. He told me that Jesus wept when Lazarus died, so they better all cry for me. That wasn't supposed to be a joke. He used to talk about something called the prayer of Jabez. He talked about how it was a prayer asking God to guide you into the types of works and services that God might desire for you. And Dana said that he once prayed the prayer of Jabez, and life was never the same again. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed with people in his life, and he said that he would say to God, "How can I possibly handle all of this?" And Dana would later warn me to be careful about what I pray for. If you pray the prayer of Jabez, he told me, you might find yourself overwhelmed with what God has in store for you. It was when I was about 20 to 22 years old. I had a few rough years where I got into a little trouble, stayed out too late every night, getting involved with things that a young man really ought to avoid. And part of the problem, as is typical with these sorts of things, is that I was hanging around with the wrong crowd. And in order to get my mind right, I knew I needed to find other things to do in the later hours of the day. I prayed that God would lead me to new friends, people that I could have fun with that wouldn't assist me in getting into trouble. And very soon after that, I bumped into Dana Troub, whom I hadn't seen for a very long time. He invited me to his farm on a day when he would have a new windmill installed. It's actually a rather odd invitation if you think about it. And I was perplexed and intrigued enough to actually attend. I found myself having coffee with Dana and other people at the Troub farm several times a week after that, meeting any number of interesting people. And eventually I would accompany Dana to things like the Michigan Antique Phonograph Society, the Model T Club, Old Car Fest at Greenfield Village, and visits to his other friends who have antiques collections, and learning to drive a Model T, taking rides in the summer, and the dinner parties. The dinner parties at his home where you never knew who was going to show up. Dana had this desire to serve the Lord Jesus Christ in any way that God saw fit for him. His willingness to be a servant led him into many people's lives. And coffee. Coffee will never be the same for me. Dana's collection is magnificent. And I love that everything was in working order. You could play music on any of the players, take a drive in a Model T or a Model A, and we made coffee with the vacuum percolators on a wood cook stove. It was the vacuum coffee makers that really captivated me when I first started visiting the Troub farm. And I'm not necessarily trying to convince you that vacuum percolated filtered with a glass rod is the best, just that I enjoy it and I think it has a unique flavor. And Dana helped me acquire a few of my own. I'm not nearly as enthusiastic about antiques as Dana, but I have a few. And the glass coffee percolators, that's what I make my coffee with at home. And now when I make my coffee at home, the flavor will remind me of my visits to the Troub farm. Dana's collection was amazing, but the truly amazing part is how each item has a deeper meaning for Dana. There's a backstory behind every item in his home, or barn, or plank house, or laying out in the yard. Unique are his objects, but just as unique are his friends. At first, it was surprising to see who would show up, but later, even the most unexpected visitor really didn't surprise me anymore. I would come by for a visit out of the blue, and Dana would be moaned that nobody had visited for several days. But within an hour, 5 more random people would show up. how did we all know when it was time to go to the Troub farm? And like the deeper meaning for each object in his collection, Dana held a deeper meaning for each person in his collection. That's the other surprising thing I learned over the years visiting with Dana, that we are all part of his collection. He collected each of us because of some unique quirk, something that complemented his own quirks. And let's be honest about that, Dana Troub is among the quirkiest people any of us will ever meet. He's the only Protestant Christian that I know who claimed to have a Catholic priest. And who else would walk into a doctor's appointment and announce that they were accompanied with their priest and undertaker, and therefore all his bases were covered? When I offered him fish once, he said, "Oh, I never eat meat from something that never had a nose." And he often referred to his friends, not by their name, but by their occupation. The priest, the undertaker, the commander. It took me a while to figure out who he meant when he talked about the stripper. A few more quirky things that he would say. "I'm not afraid of dying, it's just that I don't know how to be dead." What do eating and hunger have to do with each other? That's what he'd say when comparing some people's use of recreational drugs to his use of recreational eating. The stripper, by the way, was Edgar. His job was removing paint. I want to take a moment to recognize the Jackson family. You made Dana part of your family. Dana not living in close proximity to his original family, he needed others in his community to fill that need. He often spoke fondly about Kevin and Terry and talked about some of the things that Lee Bob and Jeffrey Bob had done or were into as though they were his own grandsons. And Dana would tell me about how Kevin would visit him as a boy and he watched him as he grew up. He talked about Stanley visiting with him over the years. I recall talking with Stanley when I began visiting. We would have coffee, always from the vacuum percolator. Stanley, who would have grown up when those vacuum coffee makers were the norm, even at a late age, enjoyed watching the coffee get sucked back down to the bottom and listening for the whoosh and gurgle as air gets pulled through the stem when all the liquid is through. Dana's desire was to bring that measure of happiness to anyone who came for a visit. It wasn't really an antique collection. At the Troub farm, it is 1905. He cooked the old way, made coffee the old way, baked bread the old way, and treated people the old way with kindness, whether you were a neighbor, family, or stranger. He once said, "Cousin Lana used to complain that I live in the past." I replied to him, "I think she has it backwards, Dana. The past lives in you." And now, my friends, Dana's memory lives in us. And a measure of the past uniquely lives on in this, Dana's collection.